One viewer waiting. Oh, just the one. Well, good day. Uh, yeah, Xenogenders. That's the thing. Um, yeah, as you probably would have read in the description. Um, yeah, I will in fact be dunking on some transphobes. With the bit of the internalized transphobia. Kind of sad, but anyway, that's for later. Um, Overall, I just want to discuss this because you know it's an interesting topic, and I feel like as a person that's studied university level gender studies and is also terminally online, I may be situated in a position where uh yeah, this might be something that I can analyze. So uh what? Yeah, with the transphobe dunking. Let's go. Yeah. Um. Well, that will in fact be the first thing. So, in doing research for this content piece, I went on some very like anti-xenogender spaces, and holy shit, they are really bad. Like they have a very narrow definition of what it means to be trans, and I think that's kind of silly because, well, there's a lot of ways to be trans. There's not one orthodox way. And so yeah, I'll be starting off by dunking on that card that I found in that space. Um, the rest of the stream is gonna be pretty standard sociology stuff. I'll be defining my terms, like what is xenogender really, how does gender work, and like defining gender roles and stuff in terms of sociology. And then I'll be looking at how exactly xenogenders function, because well, there's a bit to unpack there. And lastly, I will be trying to figure out, okay, how does it fit into gender in sociology, yeah, in a sociological sense. Woo. Okay. Um. Yes, that stupid card that is stupid. It's yeah. Oops, not me. That's what I wanted to hide. Okay. Um. So it looks pretty reasonable and like well intentioned, right? Yeah. So the point they're trying to make, that like they're trying to tie in both of these together, and it's very funny what they do. So before I go into this, I will say again that yes, this is like transphobic, honestly. Like specifically, it's very much of like the kind of like transmedicalism and like true scum ideology in a sense, right? Like they're saying that there's a specific way to be trans, and they're acting like they speak for all trans people. And hi, as you could probably tell from my voice, I'm a trans people, and I don't agree with the site. So, without further ado, let's get into what's wrong with it. Okay, that first bit is like, um, yeah, it's endangered by the unbased affirmations. Trans people online identifying with xenogenders and using neopronouns, or even just in person, is not why trans people are oppressed. I'm gonna just put that out there to begin with. Um, Secondly, I think this part where they talk about death threats, like no one should receive death threats. I'm gonna just start off with that. That said, I highly doubt that people that are, you know, using xenogenders are the kind of people that would send death threats. Okay. Anyway, what are pronouns? This is a fun one. So they define it as personal pronoun is short word use a simple substitute for the proper name of a person, blah blah blah. Grammatical person, gender, number, case. Pretty standard stuff, right? Um so this assertion here where they're like, oh, it represents a part of the population and tells somebody about part of your identity, right? Okay. Let me get this straight. So if a neopronoun tells you that someone may not be, cis or maybe some flavor of non-binary, right? Is that not conveying part of an identity, right? This is just such a silly like it's a very silly like way to describe it. Now, you could make the case they don't, right? I'm being a little bit charitable, right? Grammarly, very prescriptivist source. Um, I'll be a little bit charitable and say, okay, sure, right? In English, pronouns are largely a closed class, a closed word class. Sure, whatever. But first off, not every language is English. In Japanese, for example, pronouns are not as closed, right? That's the first bit. And second of all, new pronouns do arise because language is made up. All words are made up. Okay. Now, this whole thing is really stupid. They're like, "Oh, cis people force neopronouns on us." Well, this citation here of solving the great pronoun problem from 1934 is not from 1934. It's from 1991, and pronouns like they and like they them, like that pronoun set, it predates this citation. Okay, and they take specific issue with thon or thon. I'm not sure how it's meant to be pronounced. I didn't look up the IPA or anything, but yeah, non-binary people don't give a crap about thon because there are other pronouns that non-binary people themselves made that they do give a crap about. Yes. And while this is true that none of the neopronouns coined by these people had any effect in society, yeah, sure, they didn't. But other neopronouns did, right? Like, if you narrow the focus down onto these two people that were especially enamored with thon, right? Like, sure, you can debate it. But like it's so silly. Like, who cares if a trans person uses neopronouns, right? Like, it's just, it's like just a little bit extra to remember besides their name, right? Like, oh, I know a person called, I don't know, Brick, and they use they them pronouns, right? Like, it's just part of knowing someone. Like, having to like learn that, okay, this person, right? Like my pronouns, for example, right? A she they, right? That's the two pronoun sets that I like. Like, who would assume by seeing me, right? Like in person, I do kind of look like an anime girl. My green hair's faded all the way from green to Mountain Dew to basically just blonde now, but I kind of look like my avatar. Would someone just assume that my pronouns are she they? They'd probably assume, like, if they're a bit of a transphobe, they'd probably assume he him based on this voice. But other people might assume she her, and that's not my like all the pronouns that I use. So, well, what makes that different from neopronouns, right? And then this Tumblr neopronouns, like you can feel the anger at Tumblr right here. Um, I think it's silly. This source, by the way, is basically it links to as you can probably see in the bottom left corner, very tiny. It links to Merriam-Webster dictionary. It basically says yes, neopronouns have been here for a long time, so we should respect all neopronouns, not just the one that a couple cis people made. But they don't read their sources, which we'll see further on. Okay, so this whole section is very funny, right? Um, so autistic people are capable of understanding social constructs. Yes, I've read uh I've read various papers on that actually. That is established that autistic people can understand social constructs. There's no issue understanding them, right? Okay. So they say identity, time, language, education, etc. They're all social constructs. Yeah. Gender, it's also a social construct. Now, this right here disproves their entire fucking point, right? They're like, oh, autistic people don't understand, so like they understand social constructs, but adhering to them or applying them to ourselves is where that like I want to see the paper. I really want to see the paper because that would be like a big slam dunk for like just scientifically proving xenogenders are valid. Like, but these sources, they don't say what they don't make the points that this you know that this whole screed is making. It's very funny because the first one is basically saying that autistic people are more likely to be trans. Oh, exactly. Like they change throughout time. Pronouns are not like 100% stable. Um ah but yeah, these sources don't say what the argument being made is saying. Okay. That's the long story short. It's very silly. And then self-diagnosis is bad. Well, look, maybe, okay, get this. Maybe understanding that you have autism is a good first step in getting a formal diagnosis so that you can get accommodations. Looking at myself with that one. But that's the thing, right? Like self-diagnosis is not inherently bad. And it kind of sets the stage as to like what these people think. The authors of this card. Now this whole section is very funny. Um okay. Words were intended to cover necessity, blah blah blah. They make a slight point here of like maybe you shouldn't use like K-pop gender, for example, as a thing, which yeah, I think that that's pretty reasonable. It does kind of feel like negative cultural appropriation, but I'm not Korean. I'm Romanian Australian. That is not Korean. So I'm a reserved judgment on that one because I'm not the person being affected by that appropriation. If a Korean person is like, yeah, that's racist, then sure. Um, but like having people know your identity and what you like and dislike on the internet, right? Like that's the thing, right? Like that is important to some people. Um, and foreshadowing, I'll talk about that in terms of xenogenders later when I actually, talk about stuff normally instead of donking on this silly card. um, but like the assertion that it works only on the internet is kind of silly because the internet is a big part of people's lives. So like that's not inherently like a downside. Like I yeah. This is really like, oh, I have depressive fits and anxiety by being called out for being exclusionary. Like, sorry, but boo-hoo? Like, I don't think that people should be sending death threats over this. They should be sending death threats over anything. But if you get like anxious by being exclusionary, there's a simple solution. It's called try and be understanding of the people around you. It works pretty well. Now, this one right here, right, is literally just, oh, respectability politics. They're saying that essentially the existence of more out there gender diverse people is the reason why all gender diverse people are oppressed. And no, gender diverse people are oppressed because society is structured in such a way that we fall down lower on the hierarchy. Anyway, this okay. Original card implies cis people can use them. Here's the thing about that one, right? They're basically arguing against the idea that a non-binary person can identify as cis. That's what this point here is, right? I don't fully understand how you can, you know, be non-binary without also being implicitly trans, because to me, trans is the umbrella term for gender diversity. But if people want to define trans slightly differently and include non-binary as a separate thing, by all means go ahead and do it. Like that's fine. People understanding themselves better is always a positive. Um this one here is literally just respectability politics again. And okay, here we go. Here's a point they make that is actually kind of valid, which is surprising considering they're just completely illogical for the rest of it. That like emoji pronouns, like having a pronoun like slight smile emoji self, right? Like that, yeah. It is an accessibility issue. And I think it's quite rare. And if I personally encountered someone with, emoji self pronouns, I'd be like, hey, that's kind of shitty to people with screen readers. Do you have other pronouns that you also would prefer? Like it's that simple, right? And maybe like I mean I'm not a disabled person myself, but I know people who are, and like if they told me, hey, this is something that makes screen readers work really badly for us, that's I would fight on their behalf as well, because you know people that are oppressed shouldn't have to fight on their own. Anyway, um this one here is funny because they're doing the exact same thing that they're accusing the other card of doing. So I'm not even gonna like go in depth on that one. That's just the accessibility thing again. Okay, here we go. Labels are not really made for individual comfort. Actually, that's one of the functions of labels. Like, labels work to provide comfort to an individual. They work to provide a shorthand in describing an experience, and they work to communicate an idea, right? I would say that xenogender labels kind of fail to efficiently communicate an idea, right? Because you have to look it up on a wiki to actually understand what exactly um, the label means a lot of the time. But that's not inherently a bad thing. If that label helps someone better understand their experiences, like literally, it's fine. It's achieving at least one or two of the functions of labels overall. Because labels are not just one singular function. But I think the authors of this card, uh, they definitely have a very zero sum idea of many things. Um, ooh, the idea that pronouns have nothing to do with gender essentially means misgendering isn't a thing. No, that decoupling pronouns from gender actually does the opposite, right? Like having the idea that pronouns don't necessarily mean gender and to not assume someone's pronouns benefits trans people overall, surprisingly. And it is not transphobic, right? Like, yeah. This one here is like, oh, neurodivergent people have a hard time in society because society. Therefore, it's the fault of xenogender people. Like, I think that is illogical. And now we have the last bit that kind of just it shows their hand that they're a bunch of transmets. The idea that gender is a social construct invalidates the experiences of trans people. No. um, I'll discuss that point further when I'm defining gender, but it is yeah. Um, we aren't making this to hurt anybody. Yes, yes, you are. Anyway, Let's get back to the slides because this is way more interesting. Okay, so uh, first up, we have terms that we need to define. Okay, so gender. Gender is a very nebulous thing. It is a social construct, actually. And my definition here, as I've written it, is socially constructed phenomenon based around multiple defined roles in society. So it is largely a social occurrence, right? It's kind of an imposition of society into our personal identity, and it is structured around specified roles, right? And so gender roles then is the next thing I want to define, which is important. It's those boxes, right, that people are socialized into. Did a video on that one. With sets of rules and regulations to follow, right? Like there are different ways to perform masculinity, different ways to perform femininity, but there are definitely privileged ways of performing them and being a gender that exist in society, right? Like the masculinity of a buff white dude is privileged above the masculinity of a, you know, the average black dude, right? Because society has intersections. Um, yes, and then socialization is the process of social learning. I did a video partly explaining it and theories of socialization. I probably should put in the description of the stream, but it's on my channel if you haven't already watched it and you somehow stumbled onto this randomly. Um, so that's gender defined, right? It is um a thing that exists. It's a social construct, but obviously there's some kind of individual influence on whether you'll fit with the one that society chooses for you or whether you want to go outside of it, right? Another thing to keep in mind as we're going towards xenogender stuff is that some writers and theorists have been like, well, gender is an axis of oppression, so maybe we should trouble gender, undermine the basis of it in society, and we get xenogender, kind of. So there are two definitions that were dominant, and so xenogenders kind of started in 2014. I looked into the history. I am a good queer historian. But essentially it started in 2014 and it was kind of defined as genders that are outside of human comprehension, right? Genders that exist as like alien even, right? That's what the xeno thing was initially interpreted as. And so the original coiner of the term, that Baphomet dude on Tumblr, right? Well, actually, I don't know what their gender was. Anyway, point is, Tumblr user Baphomet, right? They coined the term and they specifically like pointed out that it is, like tied to aliens by misinterpreting what xeno really means. I mean, the definition of xeno stuff, it is associated with aliens in society due to like movies that refer to aliens as xenos, but xeno as a prefix generally means foreign, right? Like outsider. And that's where xenophobia comes from, fear of outsiders, right? Now, after 2020, there was kind of a new definition that arose, especially tied in with autism, where it's just an umbrella term for non-binary genders that aren't defined in terms of traditional genders, right? Like not defined in terms of masculinity and femininity, which has a lot of people with their panties in a twist. I Initially I was a bit skeptical, but I did my research and there is a space for them, right? So, how do they function? Yes, it does what now? So, gender is important in society, as people have found, because, well, gender dictates your pay. It dictates where you pee for some reason. It dictates the kind of jobs that are harder for you to get. It basically is a very big thing in society, right? In addition, it also places very strict expectations on people. So the idea that if you're a man, you have to act a certain way and be very like tough, hide your emotions, right, is restrictive to some people. Conversely, the idea that if you're a woman, you have to be kind, gentle, and not, be loudmouthed, that's also, you know, very imposing and strict on people. Of course, there are different ways to trouble gender, right? There are ways of performing masculinities, and there are new masculinities arising, right? Where men are performing masculinity in a way that lets them show their emotions, lets them be caring and kind, right? Of course, reactionary elements society would label that kind of thing as like, if we're going back 15 years, metrosexual, which is really dumb. They also call people like that gay because, oh, you're being more feminine. Well, it's not necessarily femininity. It's a different form of masculinity. Of course, there's ways of expanding gender beyond just expanding the boxes of masculinity and femininity. Some people just exist outside of them, right? Some people identify with non-binariness, right? And say, well, my experience of gender is that this imposition bad. Therefore, I'm going to perform gender in a different way, right? And so non-binary people go the full spectrum, right? There's uh like there's the spectrum of people that exist between masculinity and femininity and combine aspects of both and perform androgyny. And there's also people that say fuck it. I'm outside of that. And so xenogenders kind of exist as that, right? Like xenogenders are kind of a subset of non-binariness that exist outside of the definition of masculinity and femininity. And so that's interesting, I think. Um, as I've noted on my slide, I some people think that society imposing gender on people is dumb, so they say fuck it, my gender is cloudy. Um, and that's the thing, right? Like these people are choosing to perform gender in such a way that it's like, okay, my gender is clouds, right? Um, yes, gender queerness. So I have noticed a thing among people that use micro labels and identify with xenogenders that there's often a lot of like duplication of older terms, right? Like people saying like, "Oh, is there a micro label for a bigender person who is at like their gender consists of both trans woman and cis man?" And it's like that's I mean that particular case is just trying to recreate the binary. It's like, oh, you are a non-binary gender, but let's fit you back into the binary kind of thing. Like, but yeah. So, um, going back to that idea of gender queerness, though, um, there is like the idea that society's labels maybe aren't adequate to describe how people experience gender and how they perform gender, and so they make up more. They make up micro labels, um, and they make up labels that are very descriptive, right? Um, like for example, what's a good one? Um, God, there's a whole like set of categories for xenogenders that people have made. It's pretty wild, honestly, but it does reflect this idea of like this person does not want to associate with the typical gender labels. And so they identify with, let's say, a hippo, right? Like they say, I'm not a man or a woman, I'm a hippo, right? And that can be liberating. And there's a very good paper on this from 2017. Um, it's linked in the description. It's called Ego Hippo. Fortunately, it's by a French person, but they're cool despite being French. And it's like it's taking on this idea of like, okay, like gender is a swimming pool, right? You have your lanes of like of man, woman, right? Of non-binary, of like it's interesting what's happened to non-binary actually, where it's kind of become a third gender in Western society. But anyway, it's a pool, right? There's lanes and you can do laps and stuff, but largely there's lanes to keep to while doing your laps. Whereas xenogenders can kind of be seen as like queering gender up again as, you know, traditional identities kind of become more what's the term, like assimilated into society and become less radical. You can go into a big unexplored lake by saying, well, I don't like gender, I'm gonna define myself via different things, right? And it's pretty cool, honestly. Like queering gender more is cool. um that said, I do think that there are some people that kind of hop onto this movement to poison the waters, like especially with stuff like meme genders, right? Like people that say, "Oh, such and such meme is a part of my identity." The way that memes work is very ephemeral, and incorporate like the idea that a meme would have that much of an impact on your identity that you would incorporate it is suspect to me. And some of the pages that I saw on LGBT wiki about meme genders were basically just, oh, a user on the wiki coined this term, right? Like, people aren't going to take xenogenders as a whole seriously if they see that a subset of them is just D's nuts gender. Like, there's genuine exploration of gender, and then there's people shitting on people exploring gender by coming up with absurd things that are just completely incoherent. And I don't know. Am I gatekeeping xenogenders? Maybe. But I think that there is definitely some poisoning of the well here. Because there is a genuine exploration of gender going on. But it's weird. And when something is weird and goes against society's, let's say, programming, right? When it goes against that programming, people like to try and tear it down, which is sad because there is genuinely gender, well, gender troubling happening here, right? Um, yeah, I I have not personally met someone that uses a meme gender. I have only seen them via the wiki as coined by wiki users. If I meet someone that genuinely uses one of these genders, I would love to hear about it. I want to understand if it is something that people genuinely use. But as it is right now, it feels like people poisoning the well of xenogenders. Anyway, autism is another key point. That card that I was dunking on earlier, it has a point that it makes, right? It's like, oh, autistic people don't have trouble understanding social constructs. However, they may have trouble applying them to themselves or adhering to them. Now, the card was trying to disprove xenogenders existing with that one, but it kind of provided a really good proof, right? The fact that there would be overlap with xenogenders and neurodivergence makes a lot of sense, like specifically autism, right? Because, well, if someone has trouble adhering to or applying a social construct, maybe you'd end up with stuff like Xenogenders, wouldn't you? Right? Um, I think that some places label it like argument from autism, right? And like dismiss it wholesale. Personally, in my reading, I mostly found papers saying that autistic people do understand social constructs. Nothing about applying them, though. So, personally, I don't have trouble understanding or applying them to myself, but autism is a spectrum, and different autistic people are going to have different experiences, just like gender, right? People are going to have different experiences of gender. And so, tying it to autism, like I don't necessarily think that autism and xenogenders go hand in hand, because there are definitely autistic people that identify with a binary gender, and there are autistic people that identify with more, I guess, normalized non-binary genders that aren't xenogenders. But I tried to get some actual data on this because I'm active in trans discords, and one of them has a decently large population of xenogender people. One person replied to the survey, and they didn't use xenogenders themselves. They basically were like, "Yeah, I'm really fine with xenogenders." Like, okay, I mean, to access the survey, you would have had to explicitly say, "Yes, I'm fine with xenogenders" in the first place. And I mentioned I want people that use them to fill it in, but anyway, it's disappointing. I do want some data on this. I don't want to just make baseless assertions. Um, but that's okay. Um, yeah. How does it fit into gender as a whole, though, then? So, I think going back to Ego Hippo, which I think is a really good paper, and you should totally read it. Click the link in the description. Very good paper. If if you don't have access to the PDF via your university, or if you're not in university, uh just DM me. Um but I'm pretty sure it's open access. Anyway, the author of Ego Hippo does bring up the point that transing your gender is not very radical anymore, with the pool analogy that I mentioned earlier, especially for queer white people, right? This is another point that I would love a lot of data on, right? Like, what kind of background outside of just gender do xenogender people have? But no one answered my survey. That's sad. But it's this idea of like, okay, subverting gender via xenogenders is a thing that can re-radicalize transness. And I think it's definitely a big part of xenogenders, right? Like, there is a decent chunk of people from my reading that view xenogenders as a way to subvert gender and say, well, is it really so important? And kind of satirizing it in a sense, right? And saying that, okay, well, you say gender is two different sets of genitals. I say gender is stored in the balls. And, you know, like, that's it, taking it to the extreme and being like, okay, well, my gender is, you know, the the clouds at night, right? The cloudy sky at night is my gender, because that's, yeah. And then there's this whole category of like aesthetic genders under xenogenders, right? Where it's like saying that, well, my aesthetic is more important than what's in my pants, right? Like, the pants are more important than what's underneath them, in a sense, right? And so I think especially aesthetic genders can kind of fulfill the, I guess, requirement of gender to kind of be performed in some way. Which, I mean, it's not a requirement. It's a way of describing how gender works, and I do think that it's a key part of it, right? The performative aspect. And so aesthetic genders, as, you know, being an aesthetic as gender, you can perform that, right? Like, our good friends that wrote that card, right, that I was really critical of, they would probably be like, "Oh, how are you going to be xenogender in public?" Right? Like, well, if you identify with an animal, you can maybe be part of the furry community and actually perform gender as that animal, right? Like being hippo gender is like maybe you walk a bit like a hippo, right? Or it references being a bit fat, right? Like that's I think that saying that it's exclusively on the internet does a disservice to the work that this kind of does to destabilize gender, to trouble gender, right? And so there's that other aspect of xenogenders maybe being, at least a subset of them, being like, okay, well, I don't want to be saddled with society's gender expectations, right? So I'm going to identify as a cat or a dog or a cloud or a fan of a certain band, right? And like, I would argue that maybe some of these are going beyond gender, right? Maybe they're not gender anymore. And they're just saying, I find this thing more important than gender and choose to base my identity around that rather than a gender identification. Because look, I think that xenogenders are labeled as gender, but not all of them are necessarily. I mean, to say that not all of them necessarily are genders is it might be invalidating to some, but let me explain. Um, so obviously in society, gender exists as a set of social expectations and associated performances and a you know impellation, as Butler would put it, that derives from your biology, right? From interpretation of biology, you're impelled to follow certain expectations and so on. Where do other things fit into that? Well, maybe they don't need to. Maybe these things can be studied in terms of gender, but they don't necessarily have to be gender, if that makes sense, right? Like, societal gender is a kind of slow to change thing, right? Superficial aspect of gender will change, but it's like the fundamental like categorization, right? It takes a whole minute to really push it to change. And so maybe suggesting that, okay, xenogenders don't have to be gender. They can exist as a way to subvert gender by saying that something else, some other part of personal identity is more important than gender. Like that can be radical in its own right, right? Um and so I think that, I mean, it's not up to me to say definitively like this is gender, this is not gender. I'm just applying a sociological lens to it. And honestly, a lot of the people that use xenogender labels probably haven't cracked open a book by Butler or done, a minor in sociology at a university level. And that's okay. Not everyone has to be steeped in theory, right? But I think it can kind of help to understand things, how they work, by reading some theory. And so if people don't want to exist outside gender and they say that, okay, well, cloud gender describes my gender as being hazy and unknowable, um, then like go ahead. Like that's subverting gender in of itself. And I think that it's not a bad thing, even if it is like labeled as gender. And maybe it doesn't fit with what people have traditionally called gender. Maybe our definition shifts to incorporate it. Like that's how society works. Things change over time. Like socialization goes brr as as it does, right? And that socialization can change over time. Now, one last point I want to make, um, that I think is kind of interesting about where xenogender fits in is that neurogenders are a kind of subset that exist, right? That describe this intersection of neurodivergencies and genders, right? And I have some thoughts on that. So I think that the idea that neurodivergence and I mean disability more broadly, especially neurological, can influence the experience of gender. That's pretty uncontroversial. And describing that experience in a particular way is like that's having neurogender as a catch-all to be like, hey, my gender experience is deeply influenced by my neurotype, right? Like that's pretty reasonable and pretty expected. Um, some people like to point it as like, oh, autism gender, where autism is a gender. I don't think that's necessarily useful because that kind of takes out the nuance of this intersection, right? Like autism does not subsume gender. It does not become gender, but it does influence it. And if there are people that use the term autism gender, for example, as a way to describe an intersection between specifically autism and their gender experience, yeah. But from what I've seen, it seems to be pointed squarely at making it be the gender, which again, mm, I think though that the fact that only neurogender and specifically like the idea of like autism gender, ADHD gender, whatever, right? Like that those exist, whereas other intersections that influence gender aren't used as labels is kind of telling and like kind of indicates how problematic it is to just point and say this other intersectional identity is gender because look, the fact that we only see autism gender or whatever appearing within these wikis and not genders like Christian gender or Muslim gender or rich gender, right? Like that we don't see those also appearing as gender descriptors in spite of the, well, the intersection of those other identities with gender and influencing one's experience of gender. Like, yeah, kind of shows how just pointing at an identity and saying that is also gender now doesn't quite work. I don't think. As an idea of overlapping and influencing, it does work. I think it's definitely an important idea to keep in mind, but autism I don't think is a gender per se. Yeah. I don't know. Is that a good place to leave it off? To just leave off. Ooh, thanks. That I will definitely be taking a look at that. Um, yeah, because there's still a lot more to unpack, and me going very in depth on this for like 2 weeks and writing a big essay maybe isn't the entirety of experience on this. So yes. Can I pin that as a? There we go. Wonderful. Now when people like watch the VOD, they'll see that as important. So yeah, that was really um thanks. Yeah. Um, if I have more thoughts on this, I probably won't do another stream on this, but yeah. Hopefully this serves as a a good way to try and integrate xenogender into more broader sociological discussions of gender. Um, yeah. I I have a last slide that has the references. I didn't quite write down like LGBTA wiki because, well, that's not going to be a thing anymore. um, Fandom is merging it into another wiki where they're very gatekeepy about what is and isn't allowed to be on the wiki. So if you're catching this before the merge, feel free to go and read up on LGBTA wiki because that's where the very pro Xenogender camp kind of congregate. The other space that is really helpful for well, there's two spaces. So the first one is the subreddit Xenogenders and more. Um, Literally, I'll just put it in the chat. It's Xenogenders and right. That that subreddit pretty nice. Um, yeah, I mean, it does feel like there's a lot of kids there, but I mean, that's not necessarily. Wait, shit, I spelled it wrong. That. Yeah, I have it on my monitor like way over there, and I can't read tiny text. But anyway, um, there are places where you can read about this. Um, if you want to be radicalized against trans meds and true scum, then you can find spaces where there's a bunch of those and read their really illogical and hateful ramblings. But I wouldn't recommend going there unless, you're tolerant to that kind of stuff, right? Like if that kind of stuff won't upset you, by all means go there and have a bit of a laugh at how stupid they are and how like exclusionary they're being and the arguments they make could really just be used against themselves. Anyway, yeah. Um Sources. They're also in the description. But I think that's all for today. And yeah, thanks everyone for watching, and I will see you in a regular sociology video next week. Let's see, what am I actually covering next week? I don't remember. Um, um, I am covering social change. Ooh, that's a good one. Yes, definitely check that out next week when it comes out because I have thoughts on social change and radical movements. But yes, that's that's all for now. And thanks again, and make sure to read. If you take anything out of this, go read Ego Hippo. It's really good. Um and really contains thoughts on xenogenders that are pretty good. Yeah. Bye-bye and see you next week.